Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to another of EnSafe's Client Education webinar series. My name is Geoff Pope. I am here in Memphis, Tennessee, and I am EnSafe's subject area lead for Clean Water Act compliance. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some recent rule changes affecting NPDES Multi-Sector General Permits. There will be an opportunity for question and answering at the end. Hopefully on the bottom of your screen, you see a couple of buttons. One should say Q&A, and if you click that, you should be able to send me a message as you have questions during the presentation. I'll be monitoring them periodically, but to maintain the flow of the presentation, I'll wait until the end to answer any questions that anyone may have, So with that, we can get started. Just a brief agenda of what we're going to be going over today. A quick refresher on NPDES Multi-Sector General Permits. We'll be talking about the proposed changes to the EPA's 2020 Multi-Sector General Permit. In particular, we'll discuss the recent Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which redefined the waters of the United States and how that applies to NPDES permits. And then we'll also discuss an emerging issue that actually was recently in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Specifically, do discharges to groundwater require an NPDES permit? So just as a refresher, what is an NPDES permit? The Clean Water Act prohibits anyone from discharging pollutants through a point source into a waters of the United States without obtaining an NPDES permit. So therefore, NPDES permits provide quantifiable limits on the discharge pollutants, as well as specific timelines for the permittees to monitor for those pollutants and to report to ensure that the discharges from a facility are protective of human health and the environment. So then what is a pollutant? Simply put, it's any industrial, municipal, or agricultural waste that is discharged into the water. It can be soil, it can be solid waste, sewage and sewage sludge, specific chemicals, radioactive materials, or even a water source that is at a high enough temperature to raise the water temperature of the receiving water above permit limits is considered a pollutant. So for a point source, that is any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance from which pollutants are discharged. Obviously, one of the most common ones is simply the end of a pipe. Although ditches can also be point sources, channels, vessels, or other floating craft, as well as concentrated animal feed operations. So then what defines an NPDES multi-sector general permit? Well, that's a discharge permit when the receiving water is a waters of the United States, but there is no identifiable point source for the discharges themselves. Or it can also be an industry or group of industries whose SIC code is identified as a common contributor of stormwater pollutants. The notices of coverage for NPDES multi-sector general permits are issued by the regulating authority, and they run for the remainder of the life cycle of the existing permit. Multi-sector general permits are usually issued on 5-year cycles. However, it's possible that for a permittee to be granted coverage in the middle of that permit cycle, so they may only get 3 years of coverage before they have to renew, or even only a single year if they come in at the end of the permit cycle. So under the multi-sector general permit, there are a group of sectors which group the industries of similar operations together based on their SIC codes. Here is just a few of, of the typical SIC codes that sometimes apply to multi-sector general permits. You've got primary metals, scrap recycling, land transportation and warehousing, etc., and as well as the related SIC codes that correspond to those sectors. So when it comes to the relationship between the EPA's multi-sector general permit and state-specific general permits, currently the US EPA manages the NPDES programs in 4 states, the District of Columbia, Native American lands and most U.S. territories. Therefore, the U.S. EPA has delegated NPDES permitting authority to the remaining 46 states and the U.S. Virgin Islands. That means that those states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, etc., they regulate their own MSGP program, as authorized by the EPA. Which then brings up the question, for a state that has been delegated NPDES authority by the EPA, why do the changes proposed by the EPA to their multi-sector general permit matter to the states if they regulate their own programs? Well, the EPA's MSGP, it establishes the floor or the baseline for how strictly the pollutants are regulated. The states that administer their own programs are required to at least meet the EPA's permit limits, or in the case of a multi-sector general permit, the benchmarks. However, the states can choose to be more restrictive if they want for benchmarks, but they cannot be any less restrictive. So therefore, the states must revise their own multi-sector general permits when they come up for renewal to match or exceed the requirements of the EPA's multi-sector general permit. So as I said, the EPA recently put out for public review and comment its 2020 multi-sector general permit. The comment period for those changes ended June 1st, and barring any, COVID-related delays, the EPA is expected to issue the final MSGP permit later this year. So some of the proposed technical changes to the MSGP, the first one is the stormwater discharge to a former or a current CERCLA or Superfund site must receive approval from the EPA before being granted permit coverage. And this would apply across all EPA regions. Currently, only EPA Region 10, that's the Pacific Northwest, requires approval for discharges to CERCLA or Superfund sites. The next proposed rule change is that permittees that use coal tar seal coats to seal paved surfaces would be required to implement stormwater control measures to actually treat PAH-impacted stormwater prior to discharge from the site. This is similar to the EPA's construction permit requirement that requires construction sites that use cationic treatment chemicals to manage sediment. They have to treat those before the stormwater is permitted to be discharged from the site. So this would be a similar process that would actually carry over to permittees that use coal tar for sealing paved surfaces. The next change is actually for dischargers that have a pending stormwater enforcement action against them. The EPA is going to extend, or is proposing to extend, the permit application review period from 30 days to 60 days to allow them additional time to review the permit application and request additional information related to the proposed stormwater control measures. This would only be for new permittees under the MSGP. Existing permittees who are simply seeking to renew permit coverage currently would not be subject to the 60-day review time. This next one is one of the more significant ones because obviously it would apply across all sectors. All permittees, whether it be new permittees or permit renewals, would be required to post signage at a publicly accessible location at the facility documenting proof of permit coverage, as well as information on how to contact the EPA if potential stormwater pollution is observed discharging from the property. Obviously, this is a pretty significant proposed rule change because it provides the public visible information on how to contact EPA if they are observing or even suspect that stormwater pollution, is occurring in discharges from the property. The next proposed rule change from the EPA is to require stormwater control measures which would be structural improvements, pollution prevention, or mitigation measures in areas that are potentially impacted by major storm events. What the EPA's proposed changes to the permit did not specify, and that they've actually requested comment on, is how would they need to quantify what those impacted areas, from major storm events would be classified. One way that it's suspected could occur is that the EPA and the permittee could use the FEMA flood maps to determine if their facility is within the 100-year or the 500-year flood zone. And if the final permit does require that, or does require stormwater control measures in the areas impacted by storm events, then, depending on what the designation for that area is, whether it's the 100-year flood zone or the 500-year flood zone, would obviously, or could obviously, bring a lot of permitted facilities under this requirement. The next one that obviously would be a pretty significant game changer, because it would apply across all sectors, is the implementation of universal benchmark monitoring. Benchmarks under the MSGP are not permit effluent limits. They're simply a means for the facilities within a sector to measure themselves in their stormwater mitigation measures against their peer industries within the sector. An exceedance of a MSGP benchmark is not necessarily a permit effluent violation like it is under an individual permit. However, there are some changes which we'll discuss here in a few minutes that would come into play. That's another proposed rule change for when permit benchmarks are observed. So currently, sector-specific benchmarks or benchmark monitoring is required for approximately 55% of the permitted MSGP facilities. So under the universal benchmark monitoring, every permittee would be required to conduct quarterly stormwater monitoring for pH, TSS, and COD, chemical oxygen demand, for the remainder of the permit term. Whether that's 5 years if you're permitted at the beginning, 3 years in the midpoint, or less time if you come in at the back end of the permit cycle. And that's in addition to quarterly sector-specific benchmark monitoring, although the sector-specific benchmark monitoring in a change would only be required for the first 4 quarters that the facility is granted permit coverage. If the average annual concentration for the sector-specific benchmarks is less than the benchmark, so that's the average for the first year, the first 4 quarterly events is less than the benchmark, then the permittee would have the option to suspend monitoring for that sector-specific benchmark for the remainder of the permit term. In sectors that have sector-specific benchmarks, obviously sites that are proactive could potentially be able to opt out of the sector-specific benchmark monitoring through aggressive stormwater mitigation measures over the life of the permit term. However, the universal benchmarks, pH, TSS, and COD, would still apply for the entire permit cycle, even if they were able to exempt themselves out of the sector-specific benchmark. With the proposed addition of universal benchmark monitoring, the EPA is considering an inspection-only option to reduce the burden of quarterly monitoring on facilities that would be considered low risk, as a compromise to the implementation of the universal benchmark monitoring. So then, again, one of the things that the EPA had not quite figured out when they put the permit out for public review, but that they did request comments on, is that what are the means to quantify who would be considered a low risk facility and therefore be able to go the inspection only route. It could be that those facilities that are considered light manufacturing based upon their SIC code could be considered low risk. Those are facilities where the manufacturing and distribution operations are typically conducted indoors, where they're not exposed to stormwater, as opposed to, to larger, more heavier manufacturing facilities where the production and handling of raw materials and chemicals is all done outdoors. Therefore, it's more likely to pose a potential threat to stormwater and therefore stormwater discharges. Another option for designating low-risk facilities could be existing permittees that had no benchmark exceedances under the previous multi-sector general permit. The EPA did not publish information on how many of its MSGP permittees had no benchmark exceedances during the previous 5 years, so I'm not entirely sure if that's a large number of permittees or a small number. Obviously, that would probably come into play as to whether or not the EPA used the number of benchmark exceedances for designating which facilities are considered low risk. So the inspection-only option, as it's proposed, could entail a comprehensive site evaluation by a certified inspector on a specified frequency during the permit cycle. Again, the EPA did not designate what they thought that frequency would be. One idea that the EPA was requesting comments on was that it could be that the comprehensive site evaluation occurred during the first year of permit coverage, and if the permittee met the conditions for inspection only, they would be exempt from doing it during the second year of coverage, but then would have to pick it back up again in the third year. Obviously, if the criteria for going the inspection only route was not met, and then the facility would not be able to qualify for that exclusion and would have to fall back to the universal benchmark monitoring. So part of the comprehensive site evaluations, it would entail a facility audit to determine how, if the facility is complying with the current MSGP. Does the facility SWIP comply with the requirements for stormwater pollution prevention plans in the MSGP? And more importantly, does the SWIP accurately reflect site conditions, or does it need to be updated? So if numbers 2 or 3 were not answered yes by the permittee, then it's suspected that they would not, would not qualify for the inspection only option. So then that brings into the question, well, what determines the certified inspector for doing the inspection only option? Well, currently, the EPA does not have a certification program for stormwater inspections, nor does it endorse third-party programs. The current MSGP only requires that a SWIP be prepared and site evaluations conducted by qualified personnel. That's someone knowledgeable in the principles and practices of stormwater controls. It's a pretty vague and pretty generic term that allows a lot of facilities to identify someone on site who can do those, but doesn't necessarily have formal training or certifications that demonstrates that they actually are knowledgeable of those principles. So it's possible that if the EPA did decide to proceed with the inspection only exemption option, that it would require a formal certification for the certified inspectors. Could be a professional engineer, a QSD, which is a qualified SWIP developer, that's a California certification, a CPESC, a certified professional in erosion and sediment controls, or several other comparable certifications which are actually issued by third-party groups and organizations. The next proposed rule change is actually impaired water monitoring. Currently, dischargers to impaired waters have to annually monitor for those pollutants for which the water is impaired. E. coli, sediment, TSS, specific metals, those sorts of things. But the permittee can discontinue that monitoring if the pollutants are not detected. The proposed rule would actually require monitoring for only those pollutants that are causing impairments in the receiving water and are present in the industrial activities. If the monitored pollutant isn't detected by the permittee for 3 consecutive years or is shown to be solely from background sources, then the proposed rule would allow the permittee to discontinue the monitoring for those pollutants which the receiving water is impacted for. So another big one is the revision to benchmark values in specific sectors. This is something that the EPA usually does when it renews its MSGP, and the 2020 proposed permit is no exception. Some of them are positive for permittees. For instance, they've removed the macronutrient benchmarks for iron and magnesium across all sectors. However, another potential game changer is the EPA is looking at implementing annual PAH loading benchmarks across a multitude of sectors. Basically, this would entail the permittee, if they're in an applicable sector, would have to monitor for a suite of PAHs quarterly. They would have to then determine their stormwater discharge volume from the site to be able to figure out the annual PAH loading in their stormwater discharges and compare that to what the benchmarks were. The EPA has added new benchmarks for sectors I, P, and R, which previously did not require any benchmark monitoring. And of special note is in Sector R, the EPA is proposing benchmarks for trivalent and hexavalent chromium, since those, since a lot of shipbuilding and boat repair does involve the use of heavy metals, specifically ones that have chromium in them. This is, this next proposed change, the tiered approach to additional implementation measures based on benchmark exceedances. That's what I, had alluded to earlier when I said that the EPA was looking at actual corrective actions for permittees that do demonstrate benchmark exceedances. The tier system that the EPA is proposing is a stepwise function, tier 1 being the lowest in terms of what is required, then tier 2, and then tier 3 being the most demanding for what's observed when a facility has benchmark exceedances. So depending on which tier a facility fell into, the additional implementation measures, they would include continued quarterly benchmark monitoring for the next calendar year, regardless of which tier the facility fell under. Tier 1 facilities would be required to implement sector-specific stormwater control measures. Tier 2 facilities would be required to implement sector-specific stormwater control measures that are dictated by the EPA in the permit itself. And then tier 3 facilities could be required, if the rule is implemented, to install new permanent stormwater controls or infiltration or retention controls on site, whether it be cover, berms, additional secondary containment, etc. So I'm going to step through an example of how the benchmark testing, and monitoring would could cause a facility to fall under a tier 1 facility. So under the proposed MSGP, a facility is implementing its quarterly benchmark monitoring, which is shown in this example here. They've got 3 sampling locations. They analyze quarterly. At the end of the 4 quarters, they average up the concentrations to determine the 4-sample annual average. Now, there are 2 samples, as you see in this example, where the average was exactly at the benchmark of 100 for total suspended solids. However, the EPA does not consider at the benchmark to be an exceedance. It would have to be at least 101 milligrams per liter to be considered an exceedance. So in this example, the 4-sample average does not exceed the benchmark, and similarly, the 4th quarter sample collected in location 3 with a concentration of 400. However, the previous 3 quarters were all non-detect. Therefore, again, the 4-sample average for that location averages out to be 100. So even though that specific quarter was 400, again, that's equal to 4 times the benchmark, but it's not exceeding 4 times the benchmark. And the 4-sample average did not exceed the benchmark of 100. This facility would not trigger additional implementation measures, in spite of the actual concentrations that were detected. You can compare that with this example where you have a facility that does its quarterly monitoring. At the end of the 4 quarters, the 4 sample average is 105, which does exceed the benchmark. Then that would trigger Tier 1 at the end of the 4th quarter. For sample location 2, they had a higher concentration in the 1st quarter of 300. The 2nd quarter concentration was 110. Therefore, they stop right there and they automatically know they're going to become a Tier 1 facility, because even if the 3rd and 4th quarters are non-detect, the average of the first 2 sampling events mathematically guarantees that the average will be greater than 100. So in that instance, they would automatically fall under a Tier 1 facility after the 2nd quarter based on the samples that were detected at that 2nd sampling location. Another example of what could cause a facility to go Tier 1, similar to the previous one, the 1st quarter, they have a TSS concentration of 405. Again, it doesn't matter if the other 3 are non-detect. The mathematical average is going to be above the benchmark. And in this case, they had a single sample that concentration was greater than 4 times the benchmark. Therefore, both of those situations would have automatically triggered a Tier 1 classification. Similarly, on the 2nd sample location, the 1st quarter was good. It was non-detect. However, then during the 2nd quarter, they had a spike in their TSS, and the concentration greater than 4 times the benchmark, also required that facility become a Tier 1 facility for additional implementation measures. The Tier 2 and Tier 3 facilities have similar triggers. They tend to be over longer periods of time. They're not just looking at a 4 quarterly average or the annual average sample from 4 quarters. The Tier 2 looks at benchmark exceedances over 2 consecutive years of monitoring. The Tier 3 looks at the average concentrations over 3 consecutive years of monitoring, but then they do have requirements for individual concentrations from individual sampling events, but those are much higher. Tier 2, it has to be 8 times the benchmark. Tier 3 looks at a 2 or 3 sampling events with 4x concentrations, or 4 consecutive sampling events greater than the benchmark. So obviously that's kind of a brief overview of the substantive proposed rule changes that the EPA is looking at in its new multi-sector general permit. Given the significance of some of these changes, specifically the tiered additional implementation measure criteria, the universal benchmark, and the universal benchmark monitoring, and the addition of new benchmarks. Some states, for example, Tennessee, have decided to hold off on renewing their state multi-sector general permit until the EPA's MSGP becomes effective, and they know exactly which of these rules are going, to pertain to them when they do choose to renew their state permit. In Tennessee's case, they are proposing to renew their 2015 general permit and just keeping it as is with no new changes for a period of 2 years to allow the EPA's MSGP to become effective, and then they can evaluate how the rule changes that do become effective in the EPA's permit need to be carried over into Tennessee's state-specific permit. So next, we'll kind of segue from the particulars of the EPA's MSGP and discuss the recently enacted Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which redefines, as I said, waters of the United States. On June 22nd of this year, the EPA and the U.S. Department of the Army, their their rule redefining the waters of the United States became law and essentially established 4 categories for federally regulated waters: territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, perennial and intermittent tributaries to traditional navigable waters, certain lakes, ponds, and impoundments, and wetlands that are adjacent to waters in categories 1 through 3. This reclassification of the categories, I'm sure as many of you know, was a significant change and reduction in the number of federally regulated waters from the previous Waters of the United States rule, which had been enacted under former President Barack Obama's presidency. The territorial seas and traditional navigable waters are, just as they sound. Those are large rivers and lakes, tidal waters, and territorial seas, which are used for interstate or foreign commerce. Obviously, the Atlantic Ocean, any of the other oceans, the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay, Erie Canal, those are just some examples of, of the waters that still are considered waters of the United States under the new rule. Tributaries that are federally regulated waters are perennial and intermittent rivers and streams that contribute surface flow to traditional navigable waters in a typical year. Now, the EPA was very careful to define what typical year means under this rule. It's basically when the precipitation is within the normal range for that geographic location based on a 30-year rolling average. And that was done to avoid biasing streams based on extreme flooding or extreme drought that may occur over, a much smaller period of time. Tributaries must flow more often than only after a single precipitation event to meet the definition of a waters of the United States. And they can connect to traditional navigable waters or seas directly or through another federally regulated waters of the United States. The lakes, ponds, and impoundments are considered waters of the United States where they contribute surface flow to a traditional navigable water or sea in a typical year. There comes that word typical year again, either directly or through other waters via channelized surface waters, culverts, and spillways, even if those channelized features are not federally regulated waters. And then they're also considered waters of the United States if they're flooded by a waters of the United States in a typical year. Classic example of this would be the Oxbow lakes that are found up and down the Mississippi River. So adjacent wetlands that are federally regulated, they have to physically touch other federally regulated waters of the United States. They can be separated from another regulated water by a natural barrier, a berm, a bank, a dune, something like that. They can be separated from another water by an artificial barrier if that barrier allows for direct surface connection, a tidal gate, a culvert, a lock, something like that, that physically allows the one water to contact another. And then, obviously, if they're inundated by floodwaters from the waters of the United States in a typical year, those are also regulated under the new definition. So as the Navigable Waters Protection Rule defines what are waters of the United States, they also define what are not classified as waters of the United States. And those are any waters that are not included in the previous 4 categories: groundwater, features that only contain water immediately following or during rainfall, farm and roadside ditches, croplands that have been converted from wetlands, but they are being used as cropland, stormwater control features, artificially irrigated lands, if they would revert to upland conditions if the irrigation stopped, artificial lakes, groundwater recharge basins, and waste treatment systems. And at the Missouri Farm Bureau a couple of years ago, they considered all of these criteria, and they actually came up with a very clever way for citizens to quickly determine in a general sense whether or not a water that they're looking at is federally regulated or not. And essentially their motto is, if you can't float us, It's not WOTUS. And lastly, I'm going to talk about a emerging issue, as I said, that recently found itself in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's discharges to groundwater requiring an NPDES permit. So think back to one of the first slides where we were defining what an NPDES permit is. It's a discharge of a pollutant to the waters of the U.S. requires an NPDES permit. So item number 2 on the recent waters of the U.S. rule specified that groundwater is not considered a waters of the U.S. because it can't be navigated. And, that's essentially what precludes groundwater from the EPA's definition of a waters of the U.S. So therefore, the correlation would, it would make sense that if groundwater is not considered a waters of the United States, then a discharge to groundwater shouldn't require an NPDES permit under the EPA's definition. Obviously, states can define groundwater within their state as a waters of the state and require a permit, but under the EPA's definition, discharge to groundwater should not require an NPDES permit. Well, in the words of a famous Saturday morning sports broadcaster, not so fast, my friend. The Lahaina, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, wastewater reclamation facility in Hawaii is currently authorized by the EPA and the Hawaii Department of Health to discharge treated wastewater from its facility through a series of Class 5 injection wells on site without an NPDES permit. In 2012, local environmental groups sued Maui County, claiming that the injection wells were in fact point sources and thereby required an NPDES permit. This aerial photograph that I'm showing on the screen, you can see the facility in kind of the top center. The circles actually are their injection wells. The estimated groundwater plume is shown, and what the University of Hawaii actually did dye tracer tests, sampling in those colored boxes offshore. They showed that as much as 60% of the water injected from the wastewater reclamation facility was reaching the surrounding oceans. And so therefore, that's why the local environmental groups were pointing to the fact that even though this was permitted to occur without an NPDES permit, should be considered a point source and therefore should require the facility to have an NPDES permit for that injection of the wastewater. The case worked itself through the smaller courts and eventually found itself in front of the U.S. Supreme Court last year. And the Supreme Court's debate in considering this case was, if they ruled in favor of the county and the wastewater reclamation facility, then that could allow other dischargers to modify how they discharge their water and their pollutants simply to avoid future permitting requirements. However, a ruling in favor of the environmental groups was seen as could potentially be leaving property owners and homeowners at fault if there were unintentional leaks of wastewater from their properties that could then take the same path as the injected wastewater and find itself in the ocean. The Supreme Court eventually ruled 6-3 that a permit for discharge was required for non-point sources that act as a functional equivalent of a direct discharge, which they felt had been demonstrated in this case. The major factors that went into their ruling was that the distance that the pollutant travels from the point of discharge to the federally regulated waterway, and then the amount of time that it was required to reach that waterway. In a clarifying statement, Supreme Court Justice Breyer used the following example. If there's a pipe that ends on a beach and that water leaving the pipe travels 50 feet to the ocean, no one would have a real objection that discharge needed to be permitted. However, if the pipe ended 50 miles from the ocean and the water flowed over the overland surface for that 50 miles, contacting other materials, and only reached the ocean a great time, in the future, then it could be argued that that did not require a permit. And given this case with the close proximity of the wastewater reclamation facility to the ocean, and with how quickly those pollutants were being detected and seen in the dye tracer test, then that's why the Supreme Court ruled that even though this was being injected to groundwater, it was acting as the functional equivalent of a direct discharge to the ocean, and therefore did require a permit. So obviously the issues at hand are that similar cases in the future will be asked to consider the functional equivalent of a direct discharge in determining whether, a source is required to have a permit or not. And it's expected that the EPA will be asked to make a determination on what the specific rules for evaluating that functional equivalent of direct discharge are. I see that there is one question that has been submitted. If there are other questions as well, please feel free to send them in. The question says, the EPA is proposing eliminating monitoring of iron in the new multi-sector general permit. Are states obligated to follow and drop iron monitoring from their permits, or can they keep it? Any opinion on what the states might do? So if the EPA does drop, or if that proposed rule change to drop monitoring, or to drop the monitoring of iron from the multi-sector general permit, does make its way into the final issue permit, then states could choose to keep the monitoring of iron in their state implemented permits if they wanted to, or they could also drop it. That goes back to the slide that I was showing, that the states have the option to be more restrictive with their permits, but they can't be less restrictive than the EPA. So if the EPA drops iron, the states have the option to drop it as well, or they may choose to keep it in if they, deem that it is, a prevalent stormwater pollutant in their jurisdiction. And as far as what the states might do, I would say that really depends on whether or not, iron, what the concentrations of iron are in the soil in that state. Is the iron occurring naturally? Is it occurring naturally at concentrations that are high enough to, to pose an impact, to the receiving water? So it's highly subjective at this point, I guess, and ultimately it depends on whether or not the EPA does choose to drop it from their permit or not. If the EPA keeps it in, then that pretty much makes the decision for the states as well. Are there any other questions? We've got about 10 more minutes. I guess I'll be happy to answer any other questions that anyone has. The next, there's another question that's come in that says, regarding the proposed multi-sector general permit, you had a slide about permitting requirements applicable to surplus sites. Would such sites have to obtain coverage under a stormwater permit even if there were no other on-site activities? For example, an abandoned site that's undergoing investigation or remediation. My opinion would be that if the facility does not have ongoing industrial activities, then they may not be subject to the MSGP requirements. And, in which case they could argue that there's no industrial operations going on. There are no stormwater pollution or stormwater pollutants present that, that could be impacting stormwater. So in that case, I think that there's a strong example that a NPDES permit would not be required for an abandoned or an inactive site. Another question is, what's the timeline for expecting the final permit from the EPA? Again, all indications that the EPA's made at this point are that the permit would, the final permit would be issued sometime this calendar year, so before the end of 2020. Obviously, that could be delayed depending on current government restrictions and slowdowns due to COVID. But yeah, based on what the EPA is saying, they expect it to be in calendar year 2020. Another question is, are there any proposed changes to the no exposure conditions or requirements? That was actually something that I did not touch on. Just briefly, if a facility that falls under a sector that would be regulated under the MSGP can demonstrate that it does not have any outside industrial activities, then therefore it can apply for a no exposure exclusion from stormwater permitting, which basically says that it doesn't have anything outside that's believed to be a threat to impact stormwater. Therefore, it should be exempted from the requirements of the MSGP, both from the sector that it falls under and to the general permit requirements. The only changes that I've heard that would pertain to the no exposure is that the EPA is considering changing the way that the form is referenced. It's currently referenced as a NEC, no exposure certification, and they're talking about changing it to, to a no exposure application or, a no exposure exclusion, just to more closely align with the language in the permit. But the actual steps that a permittee would go through to qualify for that seem to be the same. Any other questions? These are all excellent questions. Thank you. Let's see. Oh, yes. Okay. There's one more. There's a couple more that's come in, actually. For universal monitoring parameters of pH, TSS, and COD, can the monitoring be suspended for the remainder of the term if those benchmarks are met? Or is that only for sector-specific parameters? So, yes. So the universal benchmarks would apply for the entire permit term because the EPA feels that pH, TSS, and COD are good indicators of potential stormwater pollution from a facility. So the sector-specific parameters the permittee can, opt out of if they show that they are below the benchmarks, but the universal benchmarks would apply regardless if the sector specifics are below the benchmark concentrations. Hope that answered that question. That is a kind of a confusing situation that the EPA's could potentially put on permittees, that they can stop sampling for some parameters but require sampling for others. Another question says, sector N, if the facility, which is a waste and recycling facility, and the NAICS number is 562920, how do stormwater ponds fall into the requirement of testing or permitting, if any? I guess it would depend on if the stormwater ponds are process related or if they are strictly for stormwater management and discharge. The individual that submitted that question, if you would like, you can send me an email to my address on the screen there, and I'll be happy to research that more for you, and get back to you on it. Non-process related. So yeah, if they're strictly stormwater management ponds and they have an SIC code that falls under sector N, then I would expect them to be required to meet the sector specific requirements for sector N. I don't have sector N pulled up in front of me, but under the current permit, the universal benchmarks would apply, as well as any sector N specific benchmarks that may be in the permit also. Another question, if a facility has a full on-site remediation and only discharge to groundwater, are they exempt from permitting under the new permit? That is kind of that gray area. It depends on what the facility or what the remediation system is discharging. If it's allowing infiltration, and if it's in a state that the EPA has permitting authority, it might be exempt. If it's in a state where the state has permitting authority, then that would depend on whether or not the state considers groundwater to be a waters of the state. And if it does, then that would probably require that remediation system to actually have an NPDES permit. Excellent questions. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you for your time. As I said, this is my phone number, at the office, and And my email address, if you think of anything else, please feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email. I'll, be happy to answer it as best I can. And, again, thank you for your time, and, hope everyone stays safe and has a great rest of the week. Thank you.